This is Ronald Simpson Bay, Director of Outreach and Alumni Engagement for Just Leadership USA. And I'm glad to be able to host you guys this afternoon for our national webinar to discuss the First Step Act. Being that, I hear a lot from you guys, from you leaders, and your concerns about the First Step Act. And from the conversations I've had with you, it became clear to me that it's important for us to have this webinar in order to us to facilitate discussion on this very important topic that not all of us agree on. And it is also important to share some insight and points of discussion for you in order to provide you with some additional information on which you can base your opinions, your positions, and your discussions. So like David Mensa would tell you, don't listen to the presentations with the attitude that you agree or you disagree, or from the perspective of being right or wrong. Listen to it with an open mind to create space for what a possibility could be and what you could take away from the conversation that would be useful. If you have any questions during the conversation, you can type them in the chat box. We'll try to get to them by the end of the program. Or you can email me the questions, and I'll make sure that they get distributed to the leadership, and we'll get back to you with an answer. But to start off, I'd like to introduce Will Heaton. He's our Vice President of Governmental Affairs and Policies. He's going to discuss with you the current political status of the First Step Act and what to expect. Will?
Thanks, Ronald. Appreciate that. And welcome, everybody, and good afternoon. I'm just going to offer some quick highlights about the First Step Act and respond to some questions that we have received. But I'll say, if there are any specific questions, as Ronald said, please feel free to contact him or myself. I'm more than happy to answer those. And I'll also say that on the Just Leadership USA website, we have a 3-page policy brief that goes into much more detail about the First Step Act and a lot of the provisions that are in it. But first and foremost, I just think as of today, the status of the bill as of right now is that it has not passed the Senate yet. There's been a lot of media attention around the bill, obviously, over the past few weeks, but there remains a lot of disagreement among senators in the Senate about specific provisions in the bill, and that has caused the Senate Majority Leader, Senator McConnell, to avoid putting the bill on the Senate floor for consideration at this time. There's still about 2 weeks, potentially 3 weeks left before the end of the year that the Senate will be in session. And so there does remain an opportunity that this bill still could get voted on and then get sent to the U.S. House of Representatives to pass before going to the president for his signature. But as of right now, the ultimate fate of the bill still remains uncertain at this time. So just in terms of kind of what the current status is of the bill at this moment. I think secondly, and Deanna will definitely speak to this shortly in her part of the presentation, but I wanted to just highlight some of the top line provisions that are in this bill. And a lot of these are specific to why Just Leadership has taken the position on this bill that it does. But I think first and foremost is sort of making sure that everybody understands that the bill that is currently in the Senate that's under consideration is actually a combination of 2 different bills. First, it's the House version of the First Step Act that focuses mainly on programming and policy changes that would be applied to Bureau of Prison Facilities and people that are incarcerated in those facilities. And then the second part of this bill are 4 sentencing reform provisions that were part of a previously introduced bill from a couple of years ago called the Sentencing Reform and Corrections Act. And the reason that these 2 bills have been combined in the Senate is because the First Step Act that was initially passed by the House did not have anywhere close to enough support to pass the Senate. And so these 4 sentencing provisions have been added on to the bill to try to increase support, namely among Republicans and some Democrats, to try to get the bill to a vote on the Senate floor. And the 4 main sentencing provisions that are in that bill are a reduction in some mandatory minimum sentences that are related to drug offenses that oftentimes, associated with like the quote, 3 strikes and you're out provisions that were passed, several decades ago. And some of those mandatory lifetime sentences would be reduced. I think second provision is that it would expand what is called the safety valve, which is a provision that allows judges to have more discretion in the types of sentences certain individuals might receive, so that they can avoid what some of the required mandatory minimums are. The third sentencing provision that is in there, is related to what's called stacking provisions, where somebody that is being charged for the first time can have many, many more years, if not decades, tacked on to their sentence if the crime for which they're being charged with involves some type of a gun or possession of a gun. And so this would roll back a lot of those mandatory sentences that are associated with that. And then last but not least is the application of a provision from the Fair Sentencing Act that regards to the disparity in the crack cocaine sentencing provisions. And I think what's important to understand is of all 4 of those sentencing provisions, only the last one that I mentioned, which involves the crack cocaine disparity, is retroactive. So the other 3 are only going to apply to anyone who is sentenced once this bill passes Congress, if it does at all. And then secondly, I think just in regards to the First Step Act that was passed by the House that deals primarily with the Bureau of Prisons, there's many bad provisions that are included in that part of the bill as well. But I think a few of the ones that we're most concerned about, and that Deanna will speak to shortly, is one, the creation and implementation of a risk assessment instrument that would be applied to everyone that is in a Bureau of Prison facility and would be used as the primary cause to determine what type of reentry programming they could access and whether or not they would be eligible to earn any type of earned time credit that would go towards early release. Secondly, is that the bill would allow for an expansion of electronic monitoring and e-carceration so that even as people were able to earn early release credits, when they leave the Bureau of Prison facility, they would be required to have 24-hour supervision. And obviously this is a concern for us just because it expands the control of the Bureau of Prisons from outside of their facilities into the communities of so many of the people that we work with on a daily basis. And then I think lastly, what's important to note is that in some of the more recent negotiations about the bill, in order to get law enforcement or more law enforcement organizations to sign on, there was a provision added that says that any of the cost savings that could be created from implementation of this bill would go to law enforcement and law enforcement resources. And so that's obviously another concern that we have about the bill. And so the last thing I just want to share then is, I think we've had some questions about this over the last few weeks as well, is just some overall perspective on the bill, and that in the media, a lot of attention has been given to just the broad impact that this bill would have. And I think when you look at it and put it in perspective, though, it's important to understand that any of the changes that could be implemented from this bill would only apply to people that are under the control of the federal government and the Federal Bureau of Prisons, which is, about 180,000 people out of the more than, close to 2 million people that remain incarcerated in this country, or the millions more that are under supervision. And then even more so, though, is that of those 180,000 people who would be eligible for some of the changes under this bill, the bill, and specifically the sentencing provisions, would only apply to at most maybe 5,000 to 6,000 individuals. And so in terms of the far-reaching impact that this bill is often being referred as having, I think it's just important to understand that the scope of what this will actually do is minimal compared to the type of bold reform that Just Leadership and many of your organizations is continually working for on a daily basis. So I'll stop there. I'm happy to answer any other questions as we move through or after the webinar. But with that, Ronald, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Will. At this time, we'll turn it over to Deanna Hoskins, who is our president and CEO, to give a presentation from the perspective of the president and the organization. Thank you, Deanna.
Thank you, Ronald. First, I want to thank everyone for joining us for this call. I felt this call was very necessary, and I want to give a disclaimer. This call is not to get anyone on the same side of where Just Leadership is, but I feel an obligation to our leaders to understand how we reached our decision. But also, I think it's a fundamental responsibility of Just Leadership to provide our leaders with the correct information so that whatever decision you decide, you are able to make that decision with the informed, correct information and even understanding the policy side of some things. I realized that after talking to various legislations, talking to national prison organizations and other organizations in this space, that even from those organizational standpoints of individuals who are commenting about the bill and about different programs that are available, that they don't understand the inside of government. And having oversaw that program, Second Chance, I realized that people were making assumptions of what was available to people returning from prison, what was available in the community without truly understanding the policy implications. And the majority of what they were saying was totally not true. So I realized if these were national organizations pushing a national agenda, if they were totally misinformed, I definitely wanted to make sure the leaders were informed with the information. So I kind of took some of the questions that people sent in, and we're gonna kind of go from there because I want to answer what we have labeled as our frequently asked questions. And one of it was, people definitely want to know, being a leadership and membership organization, what was our process in deciding to oppose this this bill? So we guide our decision-making totally on our mission of our organization to cut the correctional population in half by 2030. And what I found out understanding when it says correctional population, a lot of people think we're just saying brick and mortar. We're saying individuals under correctional control. So when you look at the 2.1 inside the brick and mortar prison, the 4.5 already on correctional control, we're looking at 7 million people up under some type of correctional control in the United States. So definitely everything we do, our mission drives our work. And that's always going to be our measure. Given that the first step includes some harmful technologies that could deprive people of programs and keep people incarcerated longer, we find it difficult to support this. And I'm saying that by it would undermine our mission, our own mission. So when we talk about harm reduction, in the first step, there's a clause that says risk assessments will be utilized to determine who gets in programming, and low-risk people will be allowed in programming. My response to that is, I'm gonna be honest with you, Black people are born high risk. Individuals in coming from deprived communities, marginalized communities, are simply more high risk on a risk assessment based on the way our communities are policed, based on our interactions. So, and I'll give you an example. A risk assessment tool within a correctional facility has what is called static questions. Those static questions are the questions that no matter what you do in your life, you'll never be able to change the fact of how old you were when you were first arrested. You'll never be able to change the fact of how many incarcerations you've had, how many technical violations you've had. Those are questions that are static within a risk assessment tool. And what I always share with people is, if my son steals my car and I call the police, he gets arrested and he goes to juvie hall with a record. From a more affluent community, the son steals the car, he gets taken to the police station and his parent gets to take him home, never having a record of an arrest. When they get old enough, and if they end up in prison, and when they sit down with a case manager to determine the programming they're going to go in, and those static questions come up, my son already has 5 points before it gets to even looking at his current behavior. So he's already scoring higher than his counterpart. And the crimes, a lot of people in this bill, they've put crime when they use the word high risk and low risk. Crime, your charge does not make you high risk. So there's an individual who could have been owning his own business, committed a violent crime of passion, but when they do the actual risk assessment, he's never had an encounter with law enforcement, he's never been arrested, he's never been incarcerated. When they get to the dynamic of his connection to the community, he was an entrepreneur, he had his own business, he's a homeowner, he has all these plus. Although he committed murder, he still scores low risk. So your crime does not validate your risk level. And that's the misleading information in this bill. When you read it, it always says high risk violent people won't be released. That does not even go together in the research term of criminal justice. So the bill is misleading in that. Another thing that we talk about, we support, I definitely want to acknowledge the women who fought for the Dignity Act to be included in this, that fought for the Fair Sentencing Act of 2010 to be retroactive. But I want to add another one off of that, what Will said. Although it's retroactive, the crack to cocaine disparity, it is not an automatic release. It says they have the ability to petition the court for release. One, there's nothing in there to provide the resources for a person to petition the court from prison because that's a cost. Two, is nothing in there that guarantees if I walk back in the court and put myself in position to be re-sentenced, that I'm going to walk out with a lower sentence. Unfortunately, the culture we've lived in has created this mechanism. So again, we're asking for for the changes to be, it should be automatic. If you're changing the crack to cocaine disparity, people shouldn't have to petition the court. They should be able to modify their charges based on the disparities that have been changed in there and be free to go. Another thing I want to, when we really talk about this, we definitely have staff, as you can see from Will's perspective, we have policy staff, we have hired who is writing policy briefs to make sure we're giving you the correct information. But we have people analyzing bills thoroughly. We're not asking ourselves, is this a win? We're not looking for a win. The way that traditional criminal justice programs operate, we are asking ourselves at Just Leadership, will this cause more harm in the long run or will it reduce harm? We don't mind the incremental policy changes that help a small group of people. It's just not ideal. We're built on bold reform. But if it's not gonna cause harm moving forward, we have no other choice but to accept sometimes what the climate gives us. But if it has the potential to cause harm in the long run, we have to stand in that principle, and we cannot support a bill that will actually potentially impact 4,000, but potentially harm 30,000. We also used our analysis based on history. If you understand the Jim Crow era, and this is just about being honest and starting to take a look at that our criminal justice system has always caused harm to Black and brown communities and immigrants. And no longer having the conversation around we need to change our policy, we need to actually make sure any policy that is coming out has the ability to heal the harm that has been done to Black and brown people. So if you look at the Jim Crow era, it was about criminalizing and containing and confining Black people with the harm extending to all people of color and even poor white people. Then we moved to the mass incarceration era, and it was about, again, criminalizing and containing people, but this time inside facilities. This bill is moving us to the e-incarceration, or the new Jim Crow, where it threatens to criminalize us and contain and control us in our communities. So the example I've been using, if you've ever been incarcerated and the sheriff, the COs come and they toss your cell and that feeling of violation, that feeling of you just went through all my personal stuff. When you're on e-incarceration and you're still under correctional control, I get to show up at your house and toss your house. Now I get to do it in front of your children and your wife. And there's a rippling effect here. E-incarceration only changes the location of incarceration. And what we're saying at Just Leadership, if a person is safe enough to send home on a shackle, why can't we create real release mechanisms that allow people to be released into the community to prove themselves? So another question that came up that I really wanted to talk about, someone asked us, what is the greatest harm of the First Step Act? And for those of you who have read our policy brief, you know that Just Leadership is totally in opposition, largely because it contains what Michelle Alexander, what we just said, the new Jim Crow, harmful technologies like risk assessment and electronic shackling, resulting in the expansion of the carceral state. My pushback has been there is nothing included in the First Step Act that prevents the carceral state from expanding. So of course, we're shifting costs from the government, as our Jared Kushner has shared, that it's going to save the government $739 million. But what they didn't say is because the cost is being shifted to the individual who has to pay to be on GPS shackling. So once the cost shift, there is nothing in this bill that prevents entry into this carceral state. So there's nothing to guarantee that we're cutting the correctional population in half, because we can almost double it, because the only reason we're having these criminal justice conversations now is because it's cost effective. It's costing the government too much. It's costing taxpayers too much. So everybody's paying attention, and we're saying that's the ridiculous thing, that we're spending so much money. I remember the conversation that to house someone on Rikers, you could send someone to Harvard. Well, if they're not on Rikers in the brick and mortar and they're in the community and they have to pay, the cost is no longer on the state. And as advocates, we lose some of our footing, because what's our argument when the population goes from 180,000 to 360,000? It's not a cost on anyone but the individuals. Again, there's too many people in this bill that are carved out from programming. Again, it goes to that high-risk individuals won't be allowed in. And when you look at the static dynamics of how a risk assessment works, algorithms are created by a company who benefits from the utilization of their risk assessment. The algorithm is never open or available to public scrutiny because the company says it's proprietary information because it's how they make their money. So even if we move towards a risk assessment and we start visually seeing the racial biases, we can't challenge the algorithm because the for-profit company owns the proprietary algorithm and they have to be willing to share it. Well, if they share it and it's determined to be racial bias, they lose their money. So therefore, there's nothing in this bill that says the transparency of the individual algorithm utilized for the risk assessment. What it does say is a committee will help in the creation. But once it's created, there is not an independent commission made up of other agencies outside the bureau, federal government, to monitor the situation to see and ensure that no harm is being caused. The bill, I want to also bring this to your attention. The bill was supported by the Fraternal Order of Police, and it directs any cost savings from this bill directly back to law enforcement instead of community reinvestment, instead of investing in the communities most devastated, most marginalized, most impacted by violence, poverty, and incarceration. But it gives this cost savings to law enforcement so that they can actually invest in technologies and information sharing capabilities. And that technology and information sharing capabilities allow for the connection of understanding who's in our communities to monitor that information. So our pushback is the money should be going to the communities most hardest hit, investing in those communities so that people can be self-sufficient. Another thing that happened when Sessions resigned, his last act walking out the door was he handcuffed the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division from what is known as consent decrees. Consent decrees held police departments liable for violations of civil rights. So your stop and frisk, St. Louis was up under a consent decree. Cincinnati, Ohio was up under a consent decree. And it says what law enforcement must do to reduce some of the racial profiling, some of the racial activities that are actually going. And I see Sue says Seattle was up under a consent decree. Sessions banned and handcuffed DOJ from holding police departments accountable. 2 days later, the Fraternal Order of Police signed on to this bill. And then when the bill comes out, we see that they get all the money from the bill. So if you just look at the domino impact of I'm not going to be held accountable if I violate your civil rights in the community, plus I get to get any more money to increase technology, police on the street, or anything of that nature. And let's be honest, guys, anytime you talk about police increasing anything, the offset, and that shows up in Black and brown communities as more policing, over policing our communities. So people say, well, what are the solutions? In our policy brief, we gave proposed solutions that does not call for stripping this bill. We asked not to do a risk assessment, but to use a human-centered needs assessment. We know there are two types of crime in this world, crimes of need and crimes of greed. And the majority of individuals who do commit crimes of need, we are still not addressing the needs of the community. We're still not addressing the economic viability in our communities. We're not addressing the substance abuse. We're not addressing the mental health. And again, this bill is addressing after you're incarcerated, there's still nothing on the inside to stop people from cycling into the system, which some of that community justice reinvestment from the cost savings back into our communities can help provide. Also, we're asking for an investment in our programs on the ground. It is the community programs that so many of you operate that get no investment. We're not connected at the table to get some of these funds. But if individuals are returning from incarceration to our communities, we need to identify the programs on the ground that are ran by directly impacted individuals, and those funds be invested back into those communities so they can continue to provide the valuable services that they're providing. I'm gonna go through the 6 things that we asked for. We asked for expanded in-prison programming available to all incarcerated individuals, not to be weaned out, or saying that violent offenses or higher risk assessment scores doesn't get you in the programs, in which the programs get you access to early release. We're asking for the elimination of a risk assessment tool altogether. Again, going back to that human-centered, individualized needs assessment. We're asking for a real release mechanism that allows people to return home to their families and communities without an electronic shackle, and that has the potential dangerous, long-lasting harm and stigma associated with that. Proposals that would limit the ability of prison wardens to engage in private partnerships. You have to remember, we have private for-profit prisons. GO and CCA had already moved their operations to electronic monitoring, and they are immune from accountability and allow the for-profit actors to drive revenue off of the incarcerated people and their families. Remember, again, if you're on GPS monitoring and shackling, you have to pay the private company that is monitoring you. So there again, GO and those other private prison industries are still benefiting from us based on what's in First Step Act. Elimination of all mandatory minimum sentences, especially ones that heavily rely on a person's offense record or that could be driven solely by the prosecutor's discretion. None of that is tied into there. And 6, ensuring that all of the sentencing reform components are retroactive. Again, Will talked about it. Out of the 4 components that are added, only the Fair Sentencing Act is retroactive. And again, it's not mandatory. They have to petition the court. But the other 3 are only if a person commits a crime once this bill passed. It is not going back rectifying the harm that was caused in our most marginalized communities. Lessons learned at this moment, I really want to say this. First, as a movement, we must be vigilant that regressive reforms will continue to be presented to us. We should know that as they come to us, they will be well resourced in operations, but with values-based organizing, we can keep up our good fight. This is not about winning. This is about taking a stand that this system has to rectify the harms of our past. 2, we have learned, by the way, that we have seen people treat one another during this time, that we must build community agreements. Personal attacks should not be okay. We are building a movement for our freedom. It's okay to disagree respectfully with our peers, but it is okay for us to lead with facts. It is not okay to dispose of people just like the system does. 3, we have learned that it is a good time for our movement to share more information and analysis and to create more space to talk about the different policies that are coming down the pike and that are impacting us at the local, state level, as well as the federal level. And that's why it was important for us to kick off that with this webinar, to begin, how do we share information and taking not only your experience of incarceration, but your level of expertise. We have people working on bail reform that we should be leading, they should be leading the conversation. So we want to start having these conversations that empowers our leaders and educate our leaders. Finally, more people have asked us about solutions. And although we did present solutions in the paper, we believe it is principal critique, and we think flexing analytical muscle is important whether or not we have a specific alternative solutions. But you never come with a problem if you aren't willing to sit at the table to actually challenge each other to come up with solutions. Importantly, we want to ensure that a major movement building shift happens so that directly impacted people are at the table from day one as the new legislation is created, not after the legislation comes out the conference room and we're giving talking points. Directly impacted people should be at the table when the ink hits the paper to actually challenge what policy looks like and how it plays out in our community. We expect that more celebrities and movement superstars will get involved, and we will welcome them as long as the work is principled and as long as they are amplifying directly impacted people's voices and not theirs. So where do we go from here? We understand the passage of the bill in California with the possible passage of the First Step Act. We must just be vigilant about risk assessment instruments and anything that causes harm. At this point, we are against risk assessment instruments. Many of our partners have taken a harm reduction position on this, which we respect. We just believe our lane on this issue is to hold the line. We don't need a commission to tell us what's going to be wrong with them. We don't need people lining and understanding what the actual implications of risk assessments are done when we have directly impacted experts within our network who can share the harms of risk assessment with the larger world. I hope we have partnered with our partners at Center for Media Justice on a project called Challenging E-Incarceration. If you want to learn more about the harms of e-incarceration, you can go to challengingincarceration.org. All the information is there. We're constantly working on some things, but our goal is to empower the leaders with the information and the resources. As our founding President Glenn Martin always said, those closest to the problem are closest to the solution, but furthest from resource and power. So I feel it is fundamentally our responsibility to make sure you have access to that resource and power in any way we can give it to you. I hope this has been helpful. If you have any questions still related to this, please feel free to reach out. We will try to get out more frequently, ask questions. We are willing to have more conversations, but I felt we needed to start somewhere to say what role is Just Leadership having in this. We're not in a fight about First Step. We're in a fight about reducing the correctional population in half by 2030 and not allowing the system to cause any more harm. And we're going to do that through empowering our leaders who are a part of our network. Thank you, and I appreciate your time today. Good night.